this is not a call by the Iranian people for a simple reform of the system. They are calling for the outright overthrow of the Islamic Republic itself. They want the theocracy gone.
Today is Sunday, November 13th. The year is 2022. This is No Easy Answers, and I'm your host, Jules Taylor. Today, like all days, I have no easy answers for you. All right, so welcome everyone to another episode of No Easy Answers, a Marxist podcast about politics, philosophy, and the human condition. My name is Jules Taylor, and I am here with return guest, friend of the show, Wahid Azal. The last time you were on, Wahid, we had a conversation about sort of the hijacking of left anti-imperialism, and today we are here to discuss. And you approached me on this, and thank you for sending me that email, man, and being like, "Hey, do you want to talk about this?" Because I think it's really important. I don't think obviously Western media is not really covering this adequately, to say the least, or to be charitable with our remarks about all of that. And I find myself sort of in a place of, admitted ignorance about this too. Like this happening, and you sending me an email, and me looking at some of the things going on. It educated me, and it's important that I think this gets out there for those of us who don't know about it, myself included. But I think also it's important to understand that this is going on in relation to other struggles and other conflicts in the world, namely, Ukraine right now as well. And so I think we'll get into how these situations, I don't know that there's a whole lot of conversations linking the two together. Maybe we'll get into some of that if any of that is generative. But anyway, Wahid, how you doing, man?
I'm doing very well. How are you?
I'm good. You are 14 hours ahead of me, so it is the same day right now, but it's like 5 p.m. where you are, right?
Yeah, about 10 minutes to 6 o'clock. Yeah,
right.
28th of October.
The weather's beautiful in Australia.
It's beautiful, but it's starting to heat up here, so we're looking forward to a really hot summer.
And we're all like, I don't know, Europe's going into a dark winter, and you're like, look, it's a hot summer down there. Yeah. This is not to make light of shit. Anyway, it's 3 a.m. over here, gal. We're gonna keep it together. So Wahid, not to even, I'm sorry to even enter this in a sort of joking way. Maybe it's not proper. Sorry. But yeah, so Wahid, this entire thing in Iran, this feminist revolution, was it like, what is going on there for that you feel that like certainly there's probably some confusion about what's happening on the left. And I just wondered what clearly is going on in your opinion. What are the ramifications of this, and maybe what's some of the history that's led to this point to bring us to where we are now with it?
Well, since you mentioned our last podcast in Dugin, Ukraine, etc., actually, I made a post on Facebook a couple of days ago, and they actually blocked me for it.
Oh, no.
Yeah, we'll talk about that as well.
Okay.
And this kind of is a segue into this discussion. I wrote reactionary talking point number 1 by those under the spell of Russian-inspired, quote-unquote, geopolitical fallacies and thinking. Every revolt and insurrection by a population against an authoritarian system ruling over them is a quote-unquote regime change operation triggered and puppeteered by an outside power, usually the United States, as if the people have no will of their own and only ruling elites qualify as embodying an authentic political will. Therefore, dictators and fascists are the good guys, and the people revolting against them are the bad guys. Dictators and fascists are forces of anti-colonialism, while revolting people are colonialists. Better not have a revolution overthrowing the corrupt mafias and kleptocracies ruling over you, or your country will be torn apart by separatists. Instead, support your murderous dictators, the fascists, kleptocracies, and oligarchs abusing you, impoverishing you, and killing your children and loved ones. Up is down, down is up, evil is good, good is evil. This above is the snake oil Duginism has sold to a whole generation of literal chumps in the West, LARPing as leftists and similar, who have surrendered the gray matter between their ears to the political and financial ambitions of literal criminals in Moscow, Tehran, Beijing, Damascus, and elsewhere. It is really as simple as that. I mean, I've been really following some of the people on places like Instagram and Facebook and what they're saying. These are kind of like the Ben Nortons, etc. And they seem to have just one formula explanation for literally anything that happens outside of the borders of the United States, where people chafing under the boot and heel of their dictators or oligarchs, etc., are by definition puppeteered by Langley or the Zionists or whatnot. What is happening in Iran has been building up for a couple of years, right? What triggered this current, what I would call, and what I did call in my Counterpunch article in September, is a revolution. It literally is a revolution. So let me qualify something, a misconception that is going around even in the mainstream media at the moment, where they're calling events in Iran a counter-revolution as a juxtaposition to what happened in 1978, 1979. Now, I would argue that what happened in 1978, 79 was in fact a counter-revolution rather than a revolution. Iran had a revolution at the turn of the 20th century in 1905, 1906, known as the Constitutional Revolution, where the population imposed the constitution on the absolutist monarchy of the Qajars. And this revolution was basically the kind of the spring of freedom for Iran that really influenced the region as well. People have speculated that it maybe have been inspired by events, contemporaneous events in Russia at the time in 1905. But this revolution really galvanized and really brought in the modernist discourse of liberty and whatnot. The first Communist Party of Iran constituted itself on the back of the Constitutional Revolution of Iran, and the various social democratic forces in Iran. The modern women's suffragette movement and women's rights movement really got going during the Constitutional Revolution. So I see the current events as kind of a link to the Constitutional Revolution of 1905, 1906, which was put down by Mohammad Ali Shah, together with his Russian cohorts, the Cossacks. They bombed the Iranian Majlis at the time and basically pushed the constitutions into an open revolt. But essentially, the constitutional movement died, and the central government of Iran didn't really do anything after that to revive it. Iran was a weak country until about 1921, when one of these Iranian Cossacks under the Russians, Reza Maxim, took power in a coup d'etat in 1921, and about 4 years later crowned himself as king, as the first Pahlavi king, Reza Shah. He was later succeeded in 1941 after the Soviet-British occupation of Iran by his son, Mohammad Reza Shah, and now we're into the kind of the close proximity of the events of the Islamic Revolution. In 1951, Mohammad Mossadegh, a nationalist premier, very popular, and kind of the linchpin of a lot of progressive forces in Iran at the time, nationalized Iranian oil, took it out of the hands of the Anglo-Iranian Oil Company. This created a lot of angst amongst the British ruling establishment, who were basically funding the post-war economy of Britain on the back of Iranian oil. So Mossadegh nationalized the Iranian Oil Company, and about 3 years later, or 2.5 years later, he was overthrown in a coup d'etat engineered by MI6 and the CIA, which reinstalled Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the son of Reza Shah, on the throne. After that event, for the next 25 odd years, the United States, Israel, and some of the European countries basically backed Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, the Shah, to the hilt. The first, one of the first intelligence services, sophisticated intelligence services at the time, was set up by Mossad and the CIA, known as SAVAK. This next 25 years after Mossadegh was a period of repression, but a kind of a comprador, statist, modernist kind of dictatorship, where all dissidents was put down and clamped down by force. The various leftist forces were mainly the focus of the state's ire. Also some reactionary forces amongst the mullahs. By and large, it was the left that took the brunt of that. And we move into the period of around the late 1970s, during the period of the OPEC boom. And from around one would say around 1977 onwards. Some of the policies of the Shah, where he was over-modernizing Iran, but at the same time not opening the political system, created the momentum for a revolution that then toppled him within 18 months. This would have, in my opinion, the point at which the so-called Islamic Revolution was triggered would have been around January of 1978, about a few weeks after Jimmy Carter had visited the Shah in Tehran, and hailed him as the island of stability in the Sea of Trouble, that famous speech of Jimmy Carter's. And this was triggered as a result of a really silly, salacious article that the royal court had published in the national newspapers of Iran against Ayatollah Khomeini. Ayatollah Khomeini had been a marginal figure amongst the mullahs. He had been kind of the putative leader of a revolt against the Shah, a very reactionary revolt from the holy city of Qom, because of some of the modernization that the Shah was bringing into Iran, and particularly around the women's rights. But this was a mistake on the part of the court, because the court, even though they had marginalized the left and a lot of the secular nationalist forces, had basically around certain segments, reactionary segments of the clerics, run rampant as kind of a bulwark against what they thought was communism, the rise of communism in Iran. This was to prove a mistake, even though Ayatollah Khomeini had been expelled from Iran following a trial in 1963, 1964. But he comes back, Ayatollah Khomeini comes back on the 2nd of February 1979 to throngs of millions, having promised for months before that Iran would, that they would bring in kind of a democratic kind of Islamic government into Iran. But it didn't take very long, almost within a month after Ayatollah Khomeini came back from Paris, that the issue of women's rights came back on the table again. The Shah, to his credit, probably one of very few pieces of legislation that were passed by the Iranian Majlis in 1975, had passed a Family Protection Act, which gave women equal rights in marriage and childcare and child custody and that sort of thing. Participation in society, work, what have you. One of the first things that this revolutionary government of the Ayatollah Khomeini did was to abolish that. But within a month after his return, he took on the women of Iran by attempting to impose the hijab, or the veil, on women. The very next day after this announcement, on the 7th of March and the 8th of March, for the next 7 days, there were massive marches and rallies by women throughout Iran protesting this attempt to put the veil on them. These rallies got progressively more violent, and it was at this point that certain supporters of Ayatollah Khomeini, these Islamists, began to pour acid into the faces of women on the street and beat them and that sort of thing. There were chants that these thugs were making, Ya Tusari, Ya Rusari, Ya Tusari, either the headscarf or a punch to the head. And so we, within the next year, they codified all of this in law, the issue of the mandatory hijab, which has actually not been a settled issue in Islamic law. But the Ayatollah Khomeini and his supporters, who then progressively over the next 8 months took power and consolidated power into their own hands, pushed the most radical Islamist interpretations of Islam imaginable, and basically foisted a theocracy on the Iranian people. And so this has been the case for the last 43 years. Mandatory hijab, the mandatory veiling of women, has been a issue of law. And the Iranian women have chafed under it, and nothing has been done about it. But progressively there have been different protest movements throughout this 43 period. Everybody knows about the 2009 Green Movement and the protest over the stealing of the election of that year, where Mahmoud Ahmadinejad, the hardline candidate, stood against Mir Hossein Mousavi, the Green candidate, who incidentally had been the prime minister and a close ally of the Ayatollah Khomeini during the 80s and during the war with Iraq. But in 2009, Mir Hossein Mousavi kind of became the voice of the voiceless. He won, by all accounts on the ground, he had won the election But Ahmadinejad and the hardliners stole this election and declared victory within hours after the polls closed in June. I think it was June 12th of 2009. And the country exploded for the next couple of weeks in protest. But, the regime had the guns, so they put it down. And then subsequently arrested Mir Hossein Mousavi and Mehdi Karoubi, who was his ally and also a presidential candidate, put them under house arrest. Then one of the dissident Ayatollahs, who had been the putative successor of the Ayatollah Khomeini, tried to become the voice of the people, but he himself died at the end of 2009. So we're starting to now move into the tens of this present century. And we have been seeing progressively, whether as a result of the international sanctions against Iran or because of the mismanagement of the economy by these mullahs and their monopolization of basically all of the industries, that people have progressively been, there have been protest movements of one form or another. There were protest movements in 2016, another one in 2017. Then we had the water riots of 2018. In 2019, around this time in 2019, there was a massive uprising throughout Iran over the fact that the Rouhani government of the time hiked the price of petrol in Iran by almost 300% overnight, literally, to get the shortfalls of revenue that they were losing as a result of the international sanctions. But this pushed a lot of the working class in Iran into the streets, and this protest movement in 2019 went on for about a month and a half or more. It is estimated that about 1,500 people lost their lives to the brutality of the regime and the clampdown that followed that. We have had other, protest movements subsequently after that. But what triggered this one was on the 13th of September, a Kurdish lady, a 22-year-old Kurdish woman by the name of Mahsa Jina Amini from the town of Saqqez in Iranian Kurdistan, had gone to Tehran to visit her family and was arrested by the guidance patrol, the Gasht-e Ershad, at the entry of the Shah Haqqani Expressway in Tehran while in the company of her brother. She was then transferred to the custody of the Moral Security, which is a branch of the police. Her brother, who had been with her when she was arrested, later told the press that the detention center that they were taken to, they were told that they were only going to receive a short briefing class about appropriate attire and then let go. But they were not let go within the hour that they were promised. His brother was then informed that his sister had had a heart attack and a brain seizure at the police station to which she had been taken. 2 hours after her arrest, she was taken to the Kasra hospital in central Tehran. According to Amini's cousin, she was heavily beaten and insulted in the police van that she was arrested in. And this was also witnessed by co-detainees. After she arrived at the police station, she is said to have fainted. It took 30 minutes for the ambulance to arrive and an hour and a half for her to get to the Kasra hospital. For 2 days after this, Mahsa Amini was in a coma at the Kasra hospital in Tehran. On the 16th of September, journalist Nilufat Almadi, who was later arrested, broke the story of the coma of Mahsa Amini, posting a Twitter photo of Amini's father and grandmother crying, embracing in the hospital hallway. Amini is held to have died in an intensive care unit later that day, although current reports are saying that she was already brain dead when she was brought into Kasra Hospital. The clinic where Mahsa Amini was treated released a statement on Instagram saying that she had already, like I said, she had already been brain dead when she had been admitted around the 13th of September. By 19th of September, the post was mysteriously deleted from Instagram.
Wow.
On the 17th of September, the police chief of Tehran stated the grounds of Amini's arrest had been for wearing her headscarf improperly and for wearing tight pants. By 19th of September, the police had released a CCTV footage showing a woman who they identified as Amini talking with an official who grabs Amini's clothing. Amini holds her head with her hands and collapses. Amini's father dismissed the footage as a quote-unquote edited version of events. Amini's brother says that he noticed bruises on her hands and head and legs. The women who were detained along with Amini said that she had been severely beaten for resisting the insults and imprecations that were being thrown at her. A published hospital picture shows Mahsa Amini bleeding from the ear and sporting bruises under her eye. In an 18th of September letter, Dr. Hossein Karampur, the top medical official at Hormozgan Hospital, pointed out that such symptoms, quote unquote, do not match the reasons given by some authorities who declared the cause to be a heart attack. They are instead consistent with a head injury and resulting bleeding, unquote. This was also confirmed by alleged medical scans of her skull leaked by hacktivists showing bone fracture, hemorrhage, and brain edema. Now, according to Iran International, the Iranian government has forged fake medical records for Amini, claiming that she had a history of heart disease and a brain tumor. On 20th of September, Dr. Masoud Shirvani, a neurosurgeon, stated on state-owned television that Amini had a brain tumor that was extracted at the age of 8. This has been disputed by the family. On September 21st, the hospital released preliminary CT scans, or what it claimed were CT scans. Government supporters stated the CT scans showed psychological stress caused by a previous brain operation. Critics state that the scans show physical beating and trauma. The Iranian government currently states that like I said, that she had a brain operation at the age of 5. Other government claims state that Mahsa Amini's father, Amjad Amini, told the BBC around 22nd of September that they had been lied to, that she had never had a medical condition, never had a surgery. 2 classmates interviewed by the BBC said that they weren't aware of Mahsa ever being in a hospital. Amjad has claimed that they will not allow the family the official autopsy report. The Amini family lawyer, Mr. Saleh Nikhbat, had told the Etemad News Online that respectable doctors believe Mahsa was beaten in custody. Nikhbat also said that the family wants a fact-finding committee to probe her death and that police footage filmed after her arrest should be handed over because they believe that the one that they released to the public is forged or heavily edited. An official 7th of October government conducted coroner report claims that Amini's death was not caused by blows to the heads and a limb and instead linked to her death to pre-existing medical condition, ruling that she had died from multiple organ failure caused by cerebral hypoxia. The report stated that Amini had a brain tumor. But in a 13th of October letter, over 800 members of Iran's medical council accused the head of Iran's medical council itself of assisting in a government cover-up of the cause of Mahsa Amini's death. Now, this has all caused a national uproar, and it caused the uproar within the moment that her death was announced outside of Castro Hospital on the 16th of September, where you had clashes of protesters with the police, and this has just basically been going on as of today for the last 43 days, and it keeps on expanding, and it's bringing in many sectors of Iranian society, whereas the 2019 protests were mainly workers and the working class. This current uprising has brought in all sectors of Iranian society, and especially the various. This is not a call by the Iranian people for a simple reform of the system. They are calling for the outright overthrow of the Islamic Republic itself. They want the theocracy gone. This is a revolution, in fact, and the slogan of the revolution is obviously, if people have been following it even minimally, is woman, life, freedom, zan zindagi azadi, and it is really a feminist revolution. That the burning of the hijab, which is one of the first things that happened outside of the Castro Hospital on the 16th of September, was women burning their hijabs, their veils. This is not a call by the Iranian people for a simple reform of the system. They are calling for the outright overthrow of the Islamic Republic itself. They want the theocracy gone. The response of the regime, obviously, over the last 43 days has been clamped down, and the brunt of the clampdowns have happened in Iranian Kurdistan. especially in the city of Sanandaj, where live ammunition has been used, and also in the south of Iran, in Baluchistan, Sistan province, in the town of Zahedan, where on the 30th of September, government troops opened fire on a congregation that was coming out of a mosque. And it is estimated that either between 28 or 80 individuals have lost their lives as a result of that event on the 30th of September. But this isn't stopping, unlike other events in the past where people would be arrested and clamped down and killed. This seems to be expanding. There are networks forming, especially on the internet. There's a very hybrid form of warfare that is happening on the part of the population against the system itself. This is now spilling over into the Russia-Ukraine conflict. Vladimir Putin has apparently promised Ayatollah Ali Khamenei, the so-called supreme leader of Iran, that he's going to help him with to clamp down and to put down this Iranian revolution. Meanwhile, during this time, we've learned that Iran has been selling drones to Russia, these kamikaze drones that are currently terrorizing the Ukrainian population. So this has just now exploded into many different levels and many different things. Let me stop here and let you ask a few questions.
Well, man, that was quite a bit, and I'm thankful for it. I so appreciate it, man. And there's so many things in there that I want to pick up on. There's there's quite a bit. Like let me start with, just to get this out of the way, and this was like something that poked into my head as we were going through the history of this. So 1979 sticks out for that region to me as the, and you seem so steeped in this that maybe you have a lead on this, but like, is there a connection between the United States beginning to fund the Mujahideen against the Soviets in 79, and I think it's the Ayatollahs who took over in the Iranian Revolution, if I have that correctly? Right. Is there like any sort of connection between CIA funding or any other nefarious dumb shit that the United States does in there?
Well, I mean, America has done a lot of dumb shit. The connections are quite interesting and actually eyebrow raising, because a lot of these mujahideen that were okay. Let's look at the timeline. The Iranian Revolution succeeds in February of 1979. Khomeini comes back on the 2nd of February. The revolution succeeds on the 12th of February. Right.
Right.
The Soviet invasion of Afghanistan happens on the 2nd of November. 2 days later, on the 4th of November, the hostages are taken in the Iranian embassy in Tehran. Now, what is quite interesting is that these Afghan mujahideen, one of the central groups within them is a murderous figure by the name of Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, who early on was funded and approached by the CIA. Gulbuddin Hekmatyar actually had his headquarters from around 1980 all the way to the end of the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan in Iran itself. This is the question that a lot of people have asked, is how is it that all these various figures of the Afghan mujahideen were fighting the Soviet Union, and who were openly known to have CIA connections, were being courted and given haven by the Iranians during the time of Ayatollah Khomeini? And the reason is, well, because, obviously, the rhetoric against America and the CIA was not as important for them as fighting, the Soviet occupation and communism in Afghanistan at the time. And as anyone who has looked at the history of CIA involvement in that region know, a lot of these very hardcore radical Takfiri and Islamist groups, beginning in the late 1960s, have in one form or another been either, directly supported by agency money or agency training, or by various proxies, whether through the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and whatnot. And this is one of the reasons why some elements of the Iranian diaspora have always held, and on some good evidence, that the revolution of 1979 itself had a sort of a tacit CIA hand. There's a book that was written. There's been several books written about this. One of this is by Andrew Scott Cooper, called The Oil Kings. He's a kind of a conservative figure, but some of the arguments that he has made and the evidence that he's brought do make some sense for people who were there Then there is Robert Dreyfus, the older brother of Richard Dreyfus, who wrote a book back in 1980 that was published in January 1981 called Hostage to Khomeini, where he outright asserts that the Democrats back in 1977, 78, under Jimmy Carter, got rid of the Shah and brought, played with fire and brought the Ayatollah Khomeini to power in Iran to basically cut and destroy the power of OPEC. So in other words, what they're claiming is that the same thing that the Shah and the CIA did to Mossadegh in 1953 happened to the Shah himself in 1978, 1979. There are a lot of various, very weird entanglements that happened in that Iranian Revolution of 1978, 1979 that cannot be explained, very easily. But one thing that a friend of mine in Europe told me, and this individual was very credible, because he had, back in the late 1970s, early 1980s, he had actually been working for various intelligence outfits in Europe, that he believed that the West, and particularly the United States, found it very congenial to have an Islamic fundamentalist government in Iran, because they found that this was the way that various left and communist forces in the region could be liquidated much more easily under the cover of religious fundamentalism. And the Iranians under Ayatollah Khomeini, particularly after they consolidate their power as a result of the taking of the American hostages, the Iranian embassy really went out of their way to basically stamp out the left, the secular left in Iran, beginning with some of the Maoist groups like the Peykar and the People's Fedayeen organization. And then later they turned on a Islamo-Marxist organization that is popular in the West as the MEK, known as the Mujahideen Akal. So this played very well. Just remember, back in the 80s, the price of oil just suddenly went up, and the policies that OPEC had been trying to put into place during most of the 1970s that almost brought Israel down as a power in the region when the Arabs boycotted Israel as a result of the Yom Kippur War. All of these things were one by one broken as a result of the rise of Khomeini and the so-called Islamic Revolution in Iran. So these things cannot be easily dismissed. I mean, it is one thing, to say that some of these sound like conspiracy theories, but you look at from the economic level of the beneficiaries and how, what happened with the price of oil, a barrel, etc., and the kind of arguments that Andrew Scott Cooper brings forth. And yes, there was definitely economic warfare going on, but economic warfare that ultimately benefited certain, at least, elites and oil companies in the West by seeing a radical Islamist government in Iran that then, exploded in all these various movements throughout the region. I mean, it was as a result of the Khomeini revolution that you have a lot of different groups, coming into being over the next 20, 30 years. Even the Afghan Mujahideen were galvanized by what was happening in Iran. And like I said, some of these major groups of the Afghan Mujahideen, such as Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's group, they actually had the actual basis and were headquartered out of Iran itself. So I don't know if that answered your question.
Well, it's a lot of that stuff, I guess, is not explained easily, as you mentioned, but all the various sort of entanglements in where the timelines align, there's a lot of open questions there. So I just thought that was one of the first things that kind of came to my mind during your opening. And, I also wanted to ask you because, I'm not familiar with like Iranian culture or anything to that end. Like I'm trying to learn as well as I went along here. But I heard earlier, as you mentioned, that this revolution, they want theocracy gone,
yes,
yeah, and which is anyway. So I just want to know if there's any sort of truth to this. I was watching various videos about Iran, and someone described like sort of Iran as a country as like having sort of like three pillars, and they said the three pillars are death to America, Death to Israel, and hijab. And I didn't. Is that like, I know that's very like that's very it's a terse sort of way of placing that, but like
This
is that
is
like
the cliche. Yeah,
is this the cliche of like liberal media or something? Yeah, tell me.
Well, I would say that these three pillars are limited to the regime and its supporters, which are dwindling. This may have been the pillar maybe in the first couple of years after the revolution by the overwhelming number of Iranians, but it is the opposite right now. Death to Israel, death to America. Now, that doesn't mean that people on the ground who are trying to overthrow the theocracy are naive about the motivations of the West and Western capitalism, etc. They're not naive at all, and nor do the overwhelming people on the ground want a return of the Shah. That's even though you have a lot of monarchists amongst the people here in diaspora who are coming and showing up to these rallies, but when you talk to the people who are putting their lives on the line right now in Iran, most of these kids, the current generation, they're not after restoring the throne to the Pahlavi, Reza Pahlavi, the son of the Shah. Right. So that's not what's going on. The economic issues are very paramount. The women of Iran have been severely disenfranchised by this extremely mafia model of economy. I call it mafia neoliberalism, which is the economic model that operates in Iran. Whether by the hijab itself, but just by issues of employment. Now, the regime claims that women have advanced, that they've ensured that women go to universities, etc. But none of this really means anything when you have, you can educate a population, but if you are deliberately barring this population from entering the workplace, or through these systems of cronyism that the regime is well known for, you're only hiring your own people, whose percentage is very minimal compared to the bulk of the population. So what that your population is educated, if they can't work, or if this is one of the reasons why a lot of the middle class and their children try to leave Iran. And this also goes for the regime elites itself. And this is one of the ironies of the current generation, is that you have an entire generation of the children of the elites and plutocrats of this system. We're all living in North America, living here in Australia, living in Europe. We call them by the term Aghazadehs, or the princelings, who are living basically on the back of their parents, and their links and patronage by that system. They've basically plundered Iran. Now they've sent all their kids, outside of Iran. There's actually a Twitter page that deals with this particular issue, and the kind of lavish lifestyles and ostentation and whatnot that you see amongst these people, it just raises your eyebrows. I saw this myself. My late wife and I saw this ourselves when we went to Iran in 2015. We could not believe the disparities of wealth that this present regime has created. Yes, the Shah was ostentation. He concentrated wealth, and he had his own class of cronies. But this current regime has expanded this reality tenfold. The kind of villas that we saw in the north of Tehran, and also in some of the hamlets and cities of northern Tehran around the Caspian, would envy anything that you would see in Bel Air or Beverly Hills and the like. So where is this money coming from?
Yeah, so I think there's clearly a qualitative difference here that leaves a lot of open questions that I am sort of, not really sure where to start with. One, I wanted to ask you, how far you think this revolution will go. But to that end, it's the qualitative difference of this is a revolution that seeks to overthrow the status quo, not I think when most people in the West think of feminism, they think of something that happened in the 60s that was largely sort of, appeased by things that happened in the market that became available, equal, the entry into the job force or something, or, I think the burning of hijabs in 2022, I don't know if that I mean, maybe it's a controversial thing to say. I don't know. But does that owe any sort of, I mean, this gets to your point of like agency of like, maybe it's Western hubris to like, to sort of, to think that
no.
okay,
Some people are crafting, a lot of these regime apologists online are kind of crafting it that way. So, a history lesson is in order. First of all, I should say this. The hijab, the veil, or the mandatory veil, is the central symbol of a system of gender apartheid. And the Islamic Republic of Iran is practicing gender apartheid, literally. So for the women to take the hijab off and burn it and refuse to put it back on and chanting slogans against the theocracy is, basically shaking the very foundations of this establishment, right?
Right.
But to go back to the whole Western thing and whether, the sans the hijab or without the hijab means the West and with the hijab means the East, I think that's a very myopic way of looking at it because Iran has a 2,500-year history.
Right.
And even under the 1,400 years of history after, the Islamization of Iran, women did have a lot more rights, than even the current regime is offering women. It wasn't the case that just before the Reza Shah and his son that women were basically boxed into the home and with veil put over them and told to shut up and just basically become baby machines and nothing else for the men. We've had a lot of female intellectuals, like I mentioned in that article that I published in Counterpunch. One of my own ancestors was one of the most pivotal figures of Iranian feminism in the last 200 years. So these things have existed. The tension has always been there. The problem has always been, and especially from around the 16th century, was that when the Safavid dynasty came into power in 1501, they basically imported a 12 Shiite ideology back into Iran, where it hadn't existed for about a 400, 500 year period, and made it a state ideology. And they had to basically bring clerics and religious priests from places like Lebanon and Iraq to be able to impose that state ideology on the people. And so for the last, since 1501, these mullahs went to town and basically then concentrated a lot of power in their own hands. They were briefly kicked out of Iran after the fall of the Safavid dynasty for roughly about a 40, 50 year period after the Safavids fell and during the short dynasty of Nadir Shah and then his successor, the Zands. But in 1798, they were invited back to Iran by the Qajars, who took power from the Zands. And immediately once these mullahs came back to Iran, one of the first things that they did, they went after the Sufis. And so you had a massive pogrom of Sufis all over Iran. Thousands and hundreds of Sufis were murdered by these people until, we come to the constitutional revolution itself. And only then women began to find, some outlet. So it has always been this particular class that didn't have a root as a enforcer of state ideology before 1501. See, this is the thing that a lot of these apologists don't take into account when they try to use the argument that, that veilless Iranian female is a symbol of Western colonialism. Well, we didn't have mandatory veiling in this way before 1979. So where is the locus of the coloniality?
Right. Yeah, I mean, I also that makes a lot of sense. That's a really good point. You mentioned 2,500 year history there, and I just had a moment where I was thinking of, is there a way that, when you think of this in terms of a 2,500 year history, does that shape or that frame your context around? I mean, maybe it does, obviously, but how does that frame your? Because I'm coming from a place where I think my history in terms of me is maybe if I knew and all that's ancestors and all of that, it would be 7 generations and that'd be it. But 2,500 years to know your ancestor was a key member of a feminist movement in the past. You're talking about stuff in the 15th century at this point. Does this this has to shape your context or shape your framing of these things a bit differently?
Sure. Sure, as long as it's not essentialized, because I'm a real sharp critic of dislocative nationalism, which is an ideology that was imported
Sure.
into Iran back in the 1920s and 1930s by the Pahlavis, where they tried to construct this identity of Iranians as these Aryans kind of misplaced in the middle of the Middle East. It's just such utter horse shit.
Yeah,
and
right.
historical. It's hilarious.
Yeah, man. Right on. Yeah, it's wild to think of like a 2,500 years. Yeah, it makes sense that like some of that would be misappropriated by these assholes who are eager to find some sort of I don't know, Hyperborean explanation or whatever the fuck they're working on. That's nonsense,
Yeah.
Yeah. So you touched on this briefly, and it's one of the things I wanted to ask you about was I haven't seen or received any information to like think this is happening, but I wonder if there's a sense of like if Russia or other countries that are I guess anti-Western, if they would think of this as a product of a spread of liberalism or globalism.
They are. I mean, Russia certainly is, and
Okay.
you have to. The Lebanese Hezbollah certainly does, and Hassan Nasrallah, their quote unquote Secretary General, has been denouncing this as that very thing.
Wow.
And so, I mean, we've also been hearing reports that Lebanese Hezbollah and also the members of the Hashd al-Shabi, this is an Iraqi-based proxy of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps, have actually been coming to Iran because the regime cannot trust all of its own troops on the ground. So they're having to import forces from their own proxies from places like Lebanon and Iraq to help with the clampdown. So this is what it is being, kind of characterized and framed as. And, Vladimir Putin, as if he's offering, as the State Department claimed that he's offering the mullahs his help in putting this down, then that means that they are looking at this. So they're looking at this as kind of their resistance, the axis, the so-called axis of resistance, as it's back against the wall. Its major central node being Iran, and so they have to stop the spread of Western liberalism. But this goes beyond liberalism. I mean, it's not just that Iranian women, want to, find a right to, wear bikinis. This is not about this. This is about rights.
Right.
Rights that this regime has denied them, rights that was at least, in a modicum or in some form was actually given to them by the Shah in that 1975 Family Law Act that did liberate women, that did give them equal rights, that did, that enshrined these things in law and made dress and all that sort of thing matter of personal choice. That's probably the only thing to his credit that the Shah should be remembered for was that Family Protection Act. I mean, everything else that he did, he was just, terrible. And his regime was actually responsible for, creating that cauldron that out of it came these reactionary Islamists. Because like I mentioned before, he targeted all of the leftist and secular nationalist groups and democratic groups, from 1953 to 1978, and left all of them fractured and basically offered the political ground to these reactionaries and nobody else. And this is why, what happened in Iran in 1970 and 79 cannot be classified as a revolution. And I've read enough about theories of revolution to know that, revolutions don't go backward. If you have a society where, women have been given the rights, equal rights, taking away those rights from women in a political situation after that does not constitute a revolutionary situation. That's a counter-revolution. In 1905, 1906, the Iranian constitutional revolution was a genuine revolution. What is happening today is a genuine revolution, but 78, 79, it was not a revolution. Now, granted, the Iranian people in 1978, 79 were bamboozled. This much is true. And rather than saying that the Iranian revolution was hijacked by Ayatollah Khomeini and his supporters, the fact of the matter is that the Iranian people were hoodwinked into believing that what they were participating in 1978, 79 was an actual revolution when it was actually a counter-revolution, to push Iran back in time rather than forward in time.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with you there totally. Like, that's got to be a counter-revolution. I wonder, like, to the extent that Iran and Russia are both sort of I mean, allies. They're selling drones to each other, right? They are cooperating, and maybe they are, insofar as their governmental structure is non-accepted. It's like theocratic on one end, and I mean, Russia being kleptocratic, there is a sort of outsized role of the Orthodox Church within that, and a sort of sacredness to the political office of the president within Russia. So like, it's not too. I don't know that it's too far. I mean, it's not a theocracy on paper, but there's a lot of things that it shares with it. But like, how much of this revolution happening in Iran right now is sort of a fracture to that overall front? Like, how much of it is
once it succeeds, it will be a complete fracture, because just remember, Iran is a trendsetter. Just like it was a trendsetter in the 80s as a result of the Khomeini revolution. You had the explosion of Islamic fundamentalism in the region. With the toppling of the mullahs that's coming, this will create an explosion in that region. So you will, very shortly thereafter, find a lot of Arab women throughout, the Gulf countries or North Africa, elsewhere, also wanting the same kind of rights. And this is, in my opinion, this is the best thing since, sliced bread, if it does come about. So this will then obviously fracture the narrative that the Russians and these Eurasianists have been pushing over the last decade and a half, and bring that crash tumbling down, at least in the Middle East, for sure.
Yeah, I feel like if there is an overthrow of the theocratic sort of government in place right now, there's definitely going to be pulled in many directions, right? I mean, you have this pull of like obviously the NATO and anti-NATO forces, but also, I mean, probably Eurasianist stuff. I mean, I just feel like and you said the youth is not ignorant towards the sort of influence of the West, and the intention of this is to it's to wholly get rid of the theocratic government. I don't really, like when I asked how far do you think this will go, I think it's also like, what do you think what is the end result of this? Like, I mean, I know you can't really speculate on the future, but like,
hopefully, I mean, what people want, and the people I talk to on Telegram and elsewhere, what we want to accomplish is, first of all, after we put aside this theocracy, we basically want a secular social democracy in Iran. Parliaments, people which means that there's going to have to be a referendum, a national referendum. But this next referendum in Iran needs to be observed, because the referendum that the Ayatollah Khomeini conducted in March, April 1979, actually on April Fool's Day in 1979, gave only two choices to the Iranian people. You either chose the Islamic Republic or you chose the monarchy. There was nothing in between. No Islamic Democratic Republic, no Democratic Republic or Republic, nothing. Just, do you want the monarchy or do you want the Islamic Republic? And Islamic Republic is what we say. We don't want a repeat of that. We want a proper, internationally observed referendum to give the Iranian people, all of the Iranian people, the choice to choose the form of polity that they want. My personal inkling is that a federal Iranian republic is probably the way to go, because of the minorities that exist in the Kurds, the Lors, the Baluchis, the Khorasanis, etc. That the issue of respecting the rights of these ethnic minorities in Iran should be a paramount concern, because this has given both Iran and the region as a whole in the last 100 years a lot of headaches. So the Kurds should be given rights. They should be given rights of their language, their culture, etc. Same goes for the Baluchis, who are mainly Sunnis, just like the Kurds are mainly Sunnis rather than Shia. These things should be respected, but the system needs to be secular. We cannot have a religious ideology of the kind that we've had for the last 43 years in any shape or form, determining the future of Iran. But, we are in the 21st century after all. A social democracy is that, when you have a country with the kind of natural resources that Iran has, it needs to think about its population so that these natural resources fund programs, fund a social welfare program of one degree or another. The poverty that the mullahs have created beyond, the international sanctions and whatnot, and the social disenfranchisement that they've created needs to be rectified. I mean, they have literally destroyed 2 generations of Iranians, in the last 43 years. So these things need to be attended to. The environmental issue in Iran, it has reached an epidemic level. Lakes and basins that were quite fertile for the last several thousand years have completely dried up under the watch of these ayatollahs. One notable one being Lake Urumia in northwest Iran. It has completely dried up. I mean, this was a lake that, as long as historical chronicles remember, was always a lake, a natural lake. It is completely parched. No thanks.
Wow.
To sort of these silly policies of these ayatollahs.
Wow. Yeah. I mean, this is a moment that, before we hit record, you were saying this was kind of a moment that you waited like 40 years for, in a way. And, and I could hear the excitement, do you, when you talk to people who are maybe on the ground or are observing this along with you, is there a mutual feeling of excitement? And if so, can you talk about that a bit?
Very much so, very excitement. Also, what I'm hearing and what people are saying to me is that there's no going back. We've crossed that, we've crossed that bridge. What do we go back to? We've taken and smashed the fundamental symbol of this system, the hijab. People are overthrowing statues of the Ayatollah Khomeini. They're taking pictures of Ayatollah Khomeini, founder of the Islamic Republic, ripping it up and burning it in the streets. The slogans that they're writing and graffitiing all over the cities of Iran. How do you step back from all of this? I mean, this point of no return has already occurred. So to quote this term that my friend, the late Peter Lamborn Wilson, once coined, temporary autonomous zone, Iran has effectively nationally become a temporary autonomous zone at the moment. So you have 2 completely parallel societies, the overwhelming number of people in the system. The system is determined to hold on to power by any means necessary, but it's not going to be able to, because it's, monetarily and financially, it is bankrupt. Its best friend, Uncle Putin, is losing the war in Ukraine. Who would have thought that was what would happen? The bankruptcy of the policies that these mullahs have pushed over the last 43 years is known to one and all, even to the children of these people themselves. They know that the jig is up. So the question is not if, the question is when will we see the kind of the end game to all of this? I think that probably in the next couple of months, maybe a little longer, maybe a little shorter, God knows, that we will enter the final phase of the toppling of this system. And, people are putting their lives on the line and they're prepared to die for it, to get rid of these ayatollahs. So, it's very ironic that the Islamic Republic of Iran, that has prided itself on its Shiite ideology of martyrdom, is now facing a population that wants a secular social democracy that is willing to engage on that level of martyrdom against it.
Yeah.
This is the kind of stuff we're witnessing at the moment. This is how the population is galvanized to take this thing down.
What if anything, does this mean for Afghanistan? Is there any, because we just straight up abandoned Afghanistan, and I feel like, I don't know, my thoughts are perhaps could there be a flood of Ayatollah over into Afghanistan, and there's another sort of Taliban 2.0 kind of thing? Or is that is that too much of a trope, maybe? Or I don't know.
Afghanistan would be the only place, Afghanistan under Taliban, that some of these mullahs could find refuge after people get rid of them, because a lot of the upper sector of these mullahs are wanted. Especially the highest ranking members of this regime, they're wanted by Interpol for all kinds of things that they've done over the last 20, 30 years. But to answer your question, the Taliban, once this revolution in Iran succeeds, a woman's revolution, a feminist revolution in Iran succeeds, the writing will be on the wall for the Taliban itself.
Right.
I don't know if you read the news a couple of weeks ago, but there was a bomb, a suicide bombing in a part of Afghanistan where these women were demonstrating in solidarity with the Iranian women.
Oh,
And a
wow.
suicide bomber came and blew themselves up in front of these women.
Wow.
So Afghanistan, unfortunately, from my assessment and my analysis, has been turned into a basket case over the last 40 plus years. On the one hand, Bush's invasion of Afghanistan in 2001 was a silly thing to do. On the other hand, the question remains that how is it that with all of its, boasted military prowess and technology, the United States was not able to defeat the Taliban?
Yeah.
And this is also when my conspiracy theorist comes out again and believes that perhaps that wasn't the goal, to get rid of the Taliban, because the people that they brought, that the United States brought to create this interim government of Afghanistan, first with Hamid Karzai, and then the later figures that they brought, these people were all corrupt, to the same level as any other oligarchy and plutocracy anywhere else. So the question is, why was the United States dealing with these people, these sort of Afghan versions of Ahmad Chalabi? And the answer is because the United States was not interested in actual nation building in the true sense of the word. And remember, poppy fields are extremely lucrative business to pharmaceutical companies. So if you have a compliant Taliban, which became an entity after Mullah Omar was ousted by the Taliban itself. The Taliban, in my opinion, and based on certain evidence here and there, is basically running a protection racket for the international pharmaceutical cartels, through the opium.
Right.
So, they want to kind of keep Afghanistan in that situation, maybe perpetually. But I think that is a mistake, because once the system in Iran changes, the writing will definitely be on the wall for the Taliban itself.
Man, I think there's, I thought when Putin first invaded Ukraine that it was similar to kind of a certain point within a game of chess, to where you just aren't able to calculate what happens next. It just becomes like sufficiently complicated to the point where, it could be any sort of result, right? And you can't really gauge how that's going to go. And so reality, as legible as reality can be, it was already getting to a point where it was you don't know what's going to happen next. It was really scary. And so the point in that chess game where something becomes complicated is sort of this is almost in that overall equation, this is certainly a wild card that has been thrown into the overall calculation of what we think is going to happen in that part of the world. And so in terms of this being a crack in the overall front of sort of theocratic and kleptocratic sort of forms of government, or in terms of this being a sort of force, that's maybe the most interesting part about that, is that this is a force from within.
Yes.
This is a something that's germinated out of their society, and much in the same way that I know that Dugin has made remarks about how for the first time the United States had an enemy kind of coming from within itself when they decided to attack. This is interesting to see that this is something growing out of that society, whereas it just seemed like Iran was and the regime, we'll call it, wasn't going to fall. Is an enemy that America just spent a whole bunch of money subsidizing Top Gun about Iran. This is fucking A, man. They were maybe the third place bronze sort of major threats to the United States. And now it seems like they're just incredibly weak. And so anyway, I don't know if you have anything to say about that, but that was just remarks that I was just thinking through this and how it was already complicated. But
it was the United States, in my opinion, and its policies. I mean, some of these policy wonks in Washington are not very smart people.
Yeah.
In many ways, and I also see the same thing about Israel itself, that Israel and the United States have actually, through their at least overt confrontational position, and also Iran's with Iran, have actually given a lease on life on the Islamic Republic in so many different ways. This regime should not have lasted as long as it did, other than the fact that, it became a pariah and a very convenient pariah to both the United States and Israel for the last 43 years. In many ways, it has been a gift that has kept on giving to the United States and Israel during all that time. Israel's policies in the region, especially since the mid-1980s when Hezbollah formed, would have not existed in the present form. So the push that would have granted the Palestinians a state by now does not exist, because Israel can claim a perpetual security threat and kind of drag its foot on that. And vice versa in Iran itself. The fact that America has a presence and its naval fleet is in Bahrain, which is not that far away from the Persian Gulf coast, has given, and also its presence in Afghanistan and then in Iraq, gave so much ammunition to these mullahs, to keep themselves in power in this particular way, as long as they have. So these, I look at the relationship of both Israel and the United States with Iran and vice versa as an extremely parasitic relationship. And in some way, the revolt of the people of that region, beginning with the Arab Spring, was supposed to be ending all of this, to create relationships of parity and mutuality, etc. But this, unfortunately, hasn't come to be, in my opinion, because of the interference of the big powers. This was the case also in Iran during the 19th century and during the Constitutional Revolution. It was the Tsarists and the British imperialists looked on the People's Revolution in 1905, 1906 with extreme suspicion. And they went out of their way, at least the Tsarists did anyway, to put this down and the influence that it would have had across their borders. And it is the same case today. Look, Mohammad Mossadegh, who's one of my heroes, he was overthrown by the MI6 and CIA, who put the Shah there. And those 2.5 years when he was prime minister of Iran, we had an experiment that, if it had been allowed organically, to succeed, would have transformed Iran, especially, but it would have also transformed the Middle East, and it would have transformed the Middle East away from these dictatorships and either of the military strongman type or of the kind of religious type that we have seen since 1978, 1979. And there would have been a genuine democratic or social democratic, culture in the Middle East by now. But this has been stymied every time, and has been, kind of, the baby has been killed in the cradle every time. I hope, and the Iranian people hope, that it won't happen again. But what is going for us this time around is that you have an extremely educated population, both within and outside of Iran, with lots of different networks. The Iranian people are extremely capable. And also the age of the internet has kind of transformed politics itself, despite the fact that certain people wanting to, control even that. But it won't be possible anymore to do the same kind of numbers that were done, in previous, even I would say, that were done during the Arab Spring to countries like Syria, etc. Because for example, what happened in Syria in 2011, it was a great thing. The people were asking for very definite, reasonable things from that system, that Ba'athist dictatorship of Bashar al-Assad. But the Arab Gulf kingdoms looked at the Arab Spring in that nascent form as an extreme threat. So they basically funneled money and arms and logistics and advisors to these head-chopping Islamist groups, that then flowed into Syria and transformed that whole conflict from one between the people of Syria, demanding their rights from a dictatorship, to basically a war between the Ba'athists, the dictatorship against these Islamist head choppers, and this was completely manipulated. Same in Egypt. The people in Tahrir Square wanted the end to that military dictatorship. They got it, but instead of getting the kind of democratic social polity that they were demanding in the elections of 2012, they had the Muslim Brotherhood under Morsi winning the election by default. And then a year later, we had that coup d'etat by the Egyptian military, and they reestablished the dictatorship of Mubarak under Sisi. And the same goes for Tunisia. The people in Tunisia, when they got rid of Ben Ali, were demanding some very definite things. They were demanding real democracy, social democracy, social justice, etc. And instead, they ended up with crazy Islamists. And all of this is manipulated from the outside, whether it's through these Gulf Arab kingdoms, like Saudi Arabia, Qatar, etc., the UAE, or even the policy wonks in the United States and Britain who look at these sorts of developments, progressive developments, with alarm. So this is something I think that the left in the West needs to be extremely mindful of, is how the imperial powers have actually thwarted and stymied real progressive forces in the region, going back to the turn of the 20th century. There's actually a very important American figure who died on the side of the revolutionaries during the Constitutional Revolution, Howard Baskerville, who was a subject actually of a recent book by Reza Aslan. And this gentleman basically fought on the side of the revolutionary against Muhammad Ali Shah and the Tsarists, and also spoke very candidly and vociferously against the presence and the influence of the British in Iran, against the constitutionalists. So these examples are there. This is not just about, people need these examples, and the left needs to learn about these examples to know that not every kind of, grassroots kind of participation by left groups or progressive groups tantamounts to colonialism. Colonialism is when, you have tanks and planes and whatnot entering, your country and taking over your system. But when people go out in the streets and protest and are fighting trenched, hand-to-hand combat with their own security forces, this is a revolution, not colonialism.
Well, I think with the things that I've become aware of just in talking to you, of like the way that this movement has taken shape since, like, I think in your article, I think you mentioned like the mid 19th century or mid 1850s or yes. So, right? But there's stuff here going back further than that. I mean, it's
yes.
And as you mentioned, like 2,500-year history. This is a movement that has had different shapes. That the mandatory hijab only came around in '79, and it was more of a counter-revolution. But this whole thing with like the sort of Western washing over this and dismissal of the agency of of the Iranian people and the way that this is not seen clearly from the West, and the way that you've brought all this to light, with the determination and the sort of the spirit of like martyrdom in some cases, and the feeling like you've crossed a Rubicon and aren't coming
yes.
back from that,
yeah.
With real intentions to get rid of a theocracy. I don't know, man. It's a wild thing. I'm glad that I had you around to have this conversation to sort of illuminate these perspectives, man. Because admittedly, I've been confused about the situation, and I think this has brought a lot of clarification. And obviously, communists should be in support of what is happening there.
100%.
Yes, 100%. So
one thing I want to remind people. Look, the Shah gets a bad rep and he deserves it, but this is something that people need to be aware of. Most of the social programs that the Pahlavis began to implement in the 60s and the 1970s, one of which was the Family Protection Act, these were platforms that were supported by both the National Front of Mohammad Mossadegh, but also they were platforms of the Iranian Tudeh Party, the Masses Party, the Iranian Communist Party of the 1950s. Social progressivism and these sorts of policy should not be really credited to the Shah, because the Shah implemented them or reappropriated them does not, invalidate them, in terms of people demanding these things returned back to Iran. This has been a problem that I've seen in discussions with a lot of people on social media. Is like, okay, well, because the Shah implemented social progressive programs, therefore this is indicative of the comprador nature of that regime, and the Iranian people's theocracy is indigenous to them. This is horseshit. It's not true at all. For multiple reasons. The hijab in the form that the mullahs and the theocratic establishment have imposed it on the Iranian women is unique to them alone. because, like I mentioned, there are multiple ethnicities in Iran, and the Iranian women of these ethnicities all have their own unique forms of dress. And yes, some of them wear headscarves, but these headscarves are, those are indigenous to those people, not the chador, or the burqa, or whatnot. So this claim of indigeneity, that certain people who are supporting the regime unknowingly, they need to go hit their history books and learn a little bit about the social history of Iran, especially on the level of the various ethnic minorities that we have in Iran, and that there are regional differences in customs of dress and whatnot from one region to another in Iran. They have been for thousands of years. So, trying to claim the mullahs and their form of dress and their modality of dress and their imposition of the chador in that form on the Iranian women itself is participating in a form of colonialism, without realizing it. So because the Shah, emancipated women, that doesn't mean that the re-emancipation of women in Iran should be looked upon as evidence of the West tampering with Iran. No, this is evidence of women wanting to, free themselves from the yoke of a extremely vicious form of patriarchy, which incidentally I noticed that the United States Supreme Court wants to impose on American women.
Yeah, no, there's a bit of similarity there, right? I mean, I think some of the videos I watched before coming into this conversation kind of drove home the point that like the hijab is nothing more than like an enforcement of a sort of subjugation on women as a means of societal control. So like to that end of societal control by controlling women, yeah, like there's such a sort of shadow there that like it's similarity that is and we find ourselves sometimes, if you watch American politics, if you follow Republicans, you're like, do they just want a theocracy? Like, is that just what they want? And so I wonder what kind of ramifications the Iranian feminist revolution will have on politics, in the United States, if any. Not that people are. I just think that like maybe it'll have an impact. I don't know, maybe, but. Probably not.
Well, you think about it. If a country like Iran, with this kind of a misogynist patriarchy that has been in power for the last 43 years, if the Iranian women manage to take it down, the ripples of this will go out. I mean, this is something that the Zizek has to his credit. I don't like Zizek very much, but to his credit, he has actually called it. And he's called it correctly, in my opinion, that the ramifications of this will be huge. And even though America as a society, North America and Europe, et cetera, are becoming quite, how shall one put it, are getting more and more rotten within, that an event like this would regalvanize forces on the ground, and especially from the secular left, to reappropriate things like democracy and rights, et cetera. The Western societies, under the oligarchies and plutocracies that rule over them, have lost the vision. That doesn't mean that the vision is wrong, right? And for Iranian women to claim or reclaim this kind of vision, in the second decade of the 21st century, would be very interesting, because then there would be no more arguments for those reactionary forces in the West itself to stymie women's rights, social justice issues, and what have you. Because it is Iran, in Iran that would have taken down a theocratic patriarchy of the kind that Iran has experienced since 1979. This would be a game changer like none other. It would also, when you have even some of these far-right figures in Europe giving respect to the Iranian women, that should tell you how impactful such a thing will be when the mullahs are actually decisively overthrown.
Wow, man. Do you have any sort of suggestions for books or other content where any listener might be able to find more information on the history or Iranian feminism in general?
Sure. I can give you a couple pages of bibliographies of stuff to look at.
Amazing.
But on the question of the veil, two books that I would really encourage people to go out and look at would be Fatima Mernissi, The Veil and the Male Elite. She's a Moroccan scholar. The other one is Layla Ahmad's Women and the Veil in Islam, where basically they did an extremely good historiographical study of the issue of the veil in Islam, and actually found its sources not to be located at the origins of Islam, that it was actually the Eastern Orthodox Christians and the Zoroastrians who at that time, in the early period of Islam, held to the veiling of women and what have you. So those are two books to definitely look at: The Veil and the Male Elite and Women and Gender in Islam, Fatima Mernissi and Layla Ahmed. History of Iran, Abbas Amanat has penned a modern history of Iran. He touches a little bit on the issue of women's rights and the women's rights movement. There are several books that have come out by various scholars in North America over the last 10, 15 years on the women's rights movement itself. In fact, there's a Wikipedia, very welcome, on the history of the women's rights movement that actually has a semi-decent bibliography of sources that you could probably look at.
Wow, man. All right, so we're going to link to some of those in the show notes. And, man, I can't thank you enough for doing this and for having this conversation. And it certainly helped me understand or have a better understanding of what's going on, and to sort of fully grasp how much of a wild card this is, and some of the potential ripple effects that may emanate outward from this movement and what's happening right now. Thanks so much, man. I appreciate it.
You're very welcome.
برای توی کوچه رقصیدن، برای ترسیدن به وقت بوسیدن، برای خواهرم، خواهرت، خواهرامون، برای تغییر مغزها که پوسیدن، برای شرمندگی، برای بیپولی، برای حسرت یک زندگی معمولی، برای کودک زباله‌گرد و آرزوهاش، برای این اقتصاد دستوری، برای این هوای آلوده، برای ولیعصر و درختای فرسوده، برای پیروز و احتمال انقراضش، برای سگهای بیگناه ممنوعه، برای گریه های بیوقفه، برای تصویر تکرار این لحظه، برای چهره ای که میخنده، برای دانش آموزا، برای آینده، برای این بهشت اجباری، برای نخبه های زندانی، برای کودکان افغانی، برای این همه برای غیر تکراری، برای این همه شعارهای تو خالی، برای آوار خونه های پوشالی، برای احساس آرامش، برای خورشید پس از شبای طولانی، برای قرصای اعصاب و بیخوابی، برای مرد میهن آبادی، برای دختری که آرزو داشت پسر بود، برای زن زندگی آزادی، برای آزادی، برای آزادی، برای آزادی.